Yeah.
Great. It's time to end the chokehold of fear. It's been too long that we've allowed cartels to endlessly war on turf in ways that are not likely to end and are likely to put a chokehold on our people. There is no security in the land. There is no peace in the land. And that is something we cannot allow to continue. We think that these policies are going to be excellent in terms of their ability to get cartels to put down their guns by being the ones that will be the smokescreen for the state. But more importantly than that, we think that the policies that opposition needs to defend are ones that are going to rampantly increase violence, that are going to lead to a bastion of violence and of death from the cartels that's going to escalate far beyond what exists in status quo. The first thing I'm going to explain are what are the desired outcomes of these negotiations and why are they likely to succeed. And for that, I think we need to explain what are the likely policies that we support. The first thing I think is disarmament treaties. These things like being able to have exceptionally like dangerous, like what do you call it, like military grade weapons that are in the hands of cartels already that they've used to fight by the state, and have amnesty agreements where they put those down, give them to the state in exchange for amnesties for the existing cartel members. Secondly, I think it's allowing them to continue their business as they do and decriminalizing components of the drug trade, leaving them alone to operate their business as they would wish to. Knowing that cartels are obviously businesses, and we wish to allow them to operate that because then when we don't actively sort of make them oppositional, then they're likely to be able to continue in the way that would be sustainable. We'll explain exactly why they would agree to that a little bit later on. Third, I think we're likely to try to incentivize territory agreements within different cartels. Note that the state can be a broker for this, and this can be an effective smokescreen to balance out their different incentives and to act as a mediator between cartel lines that can work out for everyone. We saw this work with Abu Sayyaf and the Mote group in the Philippines, where they were able to get rebel groups to agree on territorial lines and to stop trying to incur upon them further on. And so that means that they're able to get ourselves in a position where the state can be the one who can be the mediator effectively to police those lines on behalf of the cartels and give them the peace that they will be continuously enforced. Fourthly, it's things like rerouting the things that they already do toward legal operations and using their supply systems toward positive aims. Los Zetos built out an exceptionally good cell infrastructure within the entirety of Mexico. I think it's probably pretty good for us to use some of the road infrastructure and the telecommunications infrastructure that they build towards some pretty good aims. But the last thing I think that we do is, in order to disincentivize their further reach in order to get people to agree toward peace, we invest into additional economic opportunities to prevent people from joining gangs into the future. And if the cartels are going to try to employ these people anyway, then we force the cartels to bargain, leading to better treatment for the people in cartel controlled areas by giving them meaningful options and optionality. Why are these policies likely to succeed? Remember, cartels operate as businesses fundamentally. They do not want violence any more than is necessary because it's actively bad for them. They lose people in terms of the number of people who get potentially locked up or die in the cause of violence against the state or violence against other cartels. They have to put constant funding into buying more and more weapons and engaging in an arms race that will lead to increasing danger for themselves and their own people, as well as increasing costs of sustaining that weaponry in wars against the state. Note that the Zapatistas in Chiapas were able to disarm successfully in areas where they did consolidate control. That demonstrates that this can be successful in places where you are not actively made oppositional. And I think that law enforcement pressure that is continuously increasing is going to go up as a result of opposition, leads to an increasing arms race where the destabilizing effect of that is likely to be very severe. You get more and more dangerous guns, more and more collateral damage, and more people affected by state violence who are then radicalized into joining gangs because of how much they've been hurt by themselves and their families. Third, we prevent the fracturing of cartels. In status quo, fractures emerge in cartel structures, often due to the differences in the willingness of different people to engage in violence. Some people have been deeply hurt by state violence or other cartels and are willing to engage more than others, versus other people are more willing to adopt and take peaceful strategies. And so when there's likely to be a peaceful solution, that means that you're likely to allow consolidation to happen within these cartels because of the fact that you get rid of the root cause for a lot of the fracturing that happens in the first place, that is within the incentive for cartels because they want to operate as large organizations with economies of scale to reduce their costs and operate effectively. But lastly, why would they not just turf war with one another instead? Turf wars similarly are not very cheap, right? Like with a reduced threat from the state, cartels can focus on maximizing their profits rather than engaging in these costly turf wars. It is on their side that turf wars become a necessity for survival. You have to use, because when you're controlling more of the land and more state resources, you have more leverage that you can use to negotiate and bargain against the state to disincentivize state entry into your areas. So you force them as a defense mechanism to war for each other, to have increasing amounts of turf, as opposed to encouraging business competition through more investment, trying to get more people, and try to have more efficient methodologies. Note, the tipping point is when the state shoots first. That is when you force defensive strategies, when the cartels are willing to spend more on their arms and pick up more guns and put their soldiers toward the firing line. When the state is not a threat, they have incentives to behave well, and we can give them the guarantees as a result of the policies that we have. And I really want to make it clear exactly how important this is. Think of the number of people who live under the threat of constant cartel violence, who now are able to have a meaningful way out, who have job opportunities and real life opportunities for them to increasingly be safer in the future because of the fact that they aren't forced into the cycle of violence through cartels needing to kidnap people in order to solve for their mobilization problems. We massively improved the life, the stability, and the peace that is affected for thousands and thousands of people. We think that's immediately debate winning for opening government. Closing opposition, please.
Do you support providing amnesty towards cartel members? And if so, what is the bar for what is forgivable?
I think we're pretty lenient as to what the bar is for what is forgivable, right? Like, I think that, like, even for leaders, we're likely to prioritize reintegrating above necessarily like ensuring like the absolute maximum amount of state pressure for punishment. And that's what I'm going to explain is bad now in our second claim, which is that militarization and mano dura would be a drastic failure. Firstly, because the state is less resourced than the cartels in many instances. Because a lot of these countries have very informalized economies, they don't have a lot of an ability to gain a lot of tax. And oftentimes there's a heavy amount of corruption within them that means that companies do not pay those taxes as well, and they have heavily lenient conditions from the state. That means the state doesn't have a lot of money to be able to spend on effectively doing things like building out lots of massive weapon infrastructures. And so there's only so much that you can continue to afford those arms races, and you are probably going to lose to the cartels and give them more control because you force them to shoot and force them to use their drug profits to buy those weapons instead of employing your people instead. Secondly, they lack territorial advantages in fighting, like the knowledge for guerrilla warfare, because these cartels are the ones who are on the ground in these places and using them as battlegrounds of operations. They're pioneering the routes through them to traffic drugs and traffic people. And so they will always have the upper hand that they can use to fight against you and beat you. Third, they often have buy-in from the civilian population. There will be civilian pushback because cartels often provide people with services on the ground. There's deep degrees of loyalty because then that means that people won't snitch on them. And so that means that they provide things like social services, provide jobs and fund schools and healthcare. And so that means that these people will turn against you on the ground. And so the state has no capacity to fight back. But lastly, prison capacity is very limited. You can't build prisons quick enough to supplement your arrest rate. This is the problem that's happening in El Salvador. So conditions get worse and worse. Gangs have recruiting grounds in these prisons that makes them increasingly stronger as the state gets weaker. This is critical. This makes the problem significantly worse and unfixable because you make cartels stronger. And when civilian buy-in gets so deep that they trust cartels more than the state, that is when you create an unaccountable, violent narco state that there's no escape from. We are remarkably proud to propose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. We would like to invite the leader of opposition here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. Speech will start with my first word. Death and violence was a rampant reality in El Salvador until we took out people's rights. Maybe we persecuted some civilians, but we put majority of them in jail. We cracked down on crime. And what that did was give a high public approval to Nayib Bukele, led to sharp decline in violence. And this high public approval allowed for more money, political capital, to be able to build the same prisons that OG points out as a problem, which led to the building of mega prisons that happened in El Salvador. Few points here. First, why on opening government you cannot just systematically get reasonable buy-in, etc. First, I want to point out the characterization of why people join gangs in the first place as point of framing, right? Note that often in these states, there's incentive to provide other jobs and other welfare programs to individuals. The reason people don't join them in the very first place is because of the top-down profit recruitment structures that have existed in this gang, meaning a lot of people want to make a lot of money in quick times. Many of them join because it's quite easy to participate in. Often it's glorified in the very first instance. So it's not often because of need, but often because it's just easier to do and it's glorified in the first place and you want to die out like a hero. Meaning in most instances, there's other opportunities already available to people and people are actively making choices to join gang because they have negative image of like state in the very first place. Second, I think I want to point out that politicians cannot implement Mano dura on their side itself, even if they want to. So even if this policy is possibly going to be effective in a utopian world, it's like a political society going and saying that we're going to be adopting a policy where we're reintegrating individuals who have committed horror and criminal, etc. It gives weapons, like ammunition to opposition parties to come and say that you're just like now doing certain things, meaning you're probably going to run out of elections and these things will get backslided. did. So maybe you're able to push this to some degree, but to be able to push this effectively is quite hard because of just the barriers that come in terms of reintegrating people, the backlash that comes from individual approval, meaning you often end up losing power, but even if you continue, you are not able to push this in complete capacity. But finally, like on our side of the house, even if we have some implementation, I think that's quite good because it causes some disruption in violences that happens in the place and gives benefit to some people in some neighborhood where you're able to associate this in reasonable capacity. Maybe on our side, there's some higher crackdown on individuals that shouldn't be cracked down on. Maybe some people who joined it because of things like necessity get fucked over on our side. We think that's okay, or the long-term benefits of large majority of people who actively didn't commit crime but are victims of it every day and so on, right? But finally, on the idea of gangs coming to negotiating table, they say, oh, the gangs are going to follow all of these protocols. They'll come to all of these businesses. They give like 4 points of amazing framing in terms of how those things will happen. But the problem here is this: even if you have a territorial system and even if you have a ceasefire, the idea that you have no consequences, that even if you commit the fault, that you'll be reintegrated back into the society, is the incentive for why gangs never operate or execute on those treaties that opening government talks about. So maybe you negotiate this, but 1 month, 1 year down the line, these things go back. Look at, for example, what happened in Latin America. So the no consequences is literally why you have race to the bottom, to have the incentive to be the first one to push boundaries around the current set of ceasefire, the first one to start these things and gain those terms because you like are both on ceasefire. The one who fires first, knowing that the other person is going to fire, means has like earlier advantage in these turf wars, etc. Right? But Gov says, oh, you care about peaceful solutions, so you won't do this in reasonable capacity. But no, leaders in these like cartels are often profit drunk in many instances. They only care about profits and they don't care about peaceful situations if they can suddenly gain like massive turfs in the first place. This individual aspects of revenge. So often at times you motivate individuals in your gang and cartels through aspects of revenge that these individual gangs hurt us, so we have to go through their territory, and you can mobilize them through aspects of revenge on why people joined them in the very first place. Or you think that we own this prior territory and this territory was always ours, and all of this is the substantial reason for why we have to engage and we cannot coexist with them in many instances. So maybe there's some incentives to be peaceful. There's a lot of other incentives to also not be peaceful, and I think the execution problem again re-manifests in the way that opening government doesn't want it to, right? But second, I also want to posit that gangs won't come to the negotiating table without the fear of military being called upon them in the very first place, right? That is, if you're operating in regular basis on violence, and maybe within this particular state that you're given some degree of amnesty and you're able to benefit from it, violence is everyday reality for you. You're doing violence when you go to different states and are smuggling those things on a regular basis. I think you still have to train for turf war because you don't know how that will manifest in reasonable capacity. Meaning, at the end of the day, unless you know that we are going to be on the back foot, that we will be the one who will be attacked through the military, that we never even come and collaborate or have that kind of buy-in in the very first place. On our side of the house, the tough on crime policing actively allows those turfs to see the peacekeeper solution, to actively like tie up their hand, give up their gun in reasonable capacity, and we come to the table with a reasonable reduced capacity such that the treaties that opening government wants can be enforced in reasonable capacity, right? But our policy also has benefits even without the buy-in. So opening government is contingent on the buy-in happening in the very first place for the policies to manifest and their impacts to manifest. And maybe they do in an ideal world, but our policies give benefit even if gangs don't come in the table in the very first place because you're able to protect people into these certain areas. CG, before I go forward.
Yeah, both you and OG kind of missed the motion. This is about campaigning strategy, not about the actual policies that will be enacted. Neither you nor OG has the fiat to say which policies will be enacted. This is just about campaigning.
But our argumentation on campaigning, on political suicide, on why individuals have lost faith in the system still works. And I'm going to make another argument that will work on your frame again. Then, on principle, we want to make a principle argument that this is just principally unjust policy and you shouldn't go for it. And I think the point here is quite simple. Harm is committed upon people and you're reintegrating them without giving them proportional violence. The premises we have are quite simple. Reintegrating is principally unjust because these people have committed massive amount of crimes. Justice in society requires proportional punishment. It's part of the social contract people agree to the justice system. When you deprioritize victims who held up their end of the contract in favor of criminals who violated their contract at the very end of basis, means that you remove from justice and you delegitimize the whole justice system that's available in the very first place. This has a few problems because there's societal signaling that happens in society in other areas that you're willing to make utilitarian concessions as long in order for like your benefits, etc., and able to delegitimize law in the very first place. This is quite bad because this delegitimize state's capacity. More people are willing to break laws, etc. More gangs are willing to call out law and see law is a fake facade in the very first instance. So those are the pragmatic harms. But also the victims feel alienated and lose faith in the system because they know they're not getting benefits. So the people who killed my mom and my dad are going out freely, and the lawsuits that ran for such a long period of time is not working. What do these individuals do? First, I think in many instances, they end up joining rival gangs because they see this gang as an enemy and the state is not giving them any benefit. So they just join this gang to get revenge, to get violence in many instances. That's how the vicious cycle of violence is established on a daily basis. Means to some extent, you're reducing state capacity when individuals are continuously joining gangs because they don't believe the state can do anything. In terms of impacting, I think there's several easy impacts on our side. First, you lower crime immediately. You make cities safe to walk in the first place. People just don't join gang. But also, you just lead to more safety, which leads to all of the arguments on investor confidence that we're able to co-opt on opening opposition.
I think that speaker for their speech would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Can you see me and hear me? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. The first thing I want to do is to explain why the policies that we are describing are likely to both be enacted and too likely to work. First, they say that people do not support it, it's a political suicide, they're not going to be enacted. I think, as we already pointed out in Vaji's speech, very often people actually do support the policies on our side of the house. That is to say that states are frequently incredibly distrusted. States are known for not providing services, for not providing employment, for failing constantly with dealing with gangs over the decades, meaning that given that many populations in lots of Latin American countries are relying on gangs for employment, for security, for services that they are using, the policies that we are suggesting are in fact relatively popular, and if you are able to do them, then they're going to be supported. Secondly, they say, oh, the gangs are not going to come to negotiating table. They care about revenge and they will do violence anyway. I would just note that when it comes to profits, there is always a calculus in terms of costs and benefits of doing violence. For the vast majority of gangs, they're going to be risk averse. That is to say that you can guarantee a relatively stable influx of profits through maintaining stability, having a route through which you can conduct activities, which we are saying that we would be allowing probably legalized, meaning that you will be not wanting to engage in violence because that always necessarily requires far more resources and it's always risky in terms of that calculus. I would know that things like revenge and just doing violence for that reason is usually not something that gangs want to do. They're hardly ever ideologically motivated. It is in the end a business, and for the business, the stability and the risk aversion is the priority. Because of that, I think the policies would work. I don't think they had any more challenges to that. Why their policies do not work? I expected it, so I prepared an explanation for why El Salvador is unique. It's not is something that can be replicable, so that teams stop using it as a general example for once and for all. First of all, El Salvador had a very unique situation where there was a previous truce, meaning that the government had very clear information about who gang members are, where they are located, and were very easy to be found. That didn't stop them from arresting tons and tons of people, but it's a very unique situation that is obviously not replicable for countries that are far larger, where you do not have that information, when you can't access the same amount of data that El Salvador had about gangs previously. Second, El Salvador, unlike states like Colombia or states like Bolivia or Mexico, is uniquely pretty much urban, which means that you wouldn't have the terrain problems that what you described as one of the biggest reasons why you can't really do the policing somewhere else, which is if you are chasing gangs around like jungles and more rural areas, then you can't be using the advantages like Air Force and military and like stuff like that. You basically need to be engaging in infantry-ish warfare, guerrilla warfare with them, where they often have higher advantage. So that's again something that wasn't true in El Salvador that is urban. So, but would be a problem if you try to replicate it anywhere else. So they can't do it. Lastly, El Salvador is just far tinier. So again, makes it much easier, requires far fewer resources. There's also much lesser number of people. And lastly, El Salvador will have, as Vachi points out, the problem in terms of longevity and making the policy work towards the future, because in the end, you will have overcrowding of prisons. And it's a very common thing that once you incarcerate people within Latin America, gangs run prisons and use them as a recruitment center where people leave out of the prisons eventually even more integrated within gang activities. So they would have to explain, not just by pointing to an example, but why this is something that they would be able to do and why it wouldn't be increasing violence as a result, as we described. We posited that they would promote violence as we are describing. It would make gangs behave worse. On our side, they would not have that same incentive to violence. So at the end of this, the state will not be able to defeat the gangs. On their side, yes, they are making their lives more difficult, but the harms that they are creating as a result of the extra violence are not worth it. On our side, we are able to reduce violence. Our policies are able to work far more. We should at least try them. We should campaign for them. The final thing to engage on this then is the principle. Obviously, they are hurting innocents by increasing violence, by prolonging the conflict and making them worse. So in the end, at least we are creating fewer future victims. What I want to do next is to give you a few more low burden claims about what even campaigning on the policies that they are describing has inherent harms, and we should be preventing them from happening. The first thing to note is that even campaigning on the policies that they are describing is opening up the candidates and politics in general to violence from gangs. That is, it's immensely common for local politicians or even higher level politicians within Latin American countries to be assassinated or intimidated as a result of even signaling towards the policies that they are proposing. That is, this is pointless because the policies wouldn't work anyway, but there are secondary implications of this, which is that it creates a chilling effect from entering politics for lots of people who would be competent, but now the just being involved in politics becomes far riskier because you're opening yourself to gang violence because they are targeting politicians as a result of the prominence of those kinds of campaigns. Second, it encourages gangs to meddle into politics far more when you are signaling these policies. Gangs begin corrupting politics more when otherwise they would not want to be putting resources into it because it's not worth it. But now you want to be influencing politicians and influencing far broader swath of politics to try to re-divert the potential state violence away from you. So again, makes the political stuff far worse as a result of this campaigning. Before I go on the last couple of things, I'll take you.
If gangs are profit motivated, it is in their interest to continue turf warring and gaining territory because they want to spread drugs and extract money from businesses. That's literally the profit.
It is not true, right? So in the vast majority of cases, you have multiple different routes that you can connect to smuggling ports, say, towards the US. For a gang, if you can get very much stable source of revenue of being able to divide between each other regionally, which of the regions you're going to control, which of the routes you're going to be using. You don't want to be warring because maybe perhaps you can increase your share, but you're also very likely to lose your share. So logically, very commonly, the colluding and the territorial division is what actually makes sense. We see it in lots of countries where the only reason that there is violence is because of the state who is targeting everyone. Thirdly, I think it preemptively affects gangs in that they do the problematic things, right? It actually encourages them to be more violent towards each other, to maximize share, to be able to resist the guaranteed governmental pressure or the pressure they're expecting to come in. So even preemptively, as a result of campaigning, gangs behave worse. Fourthly, it alienates a lot of areas where cartels are currently popular. I noted it at the beginning of my speech. There are many areas where government is incredibly distrusted, like Sinaloa within Mexico. Gangs provide employment, supplement services. Those people are far less likely to engage with the state, far less likely to vote within elections. If this is common source of campaigning, all of this is quite bad. I'm proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for their speech. We would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to end the top half of the debate here.
Sorry, one second. Cool. Can I be seen and heard?
Yeah.
Three. Yeah, POI me in the chat, please. The dismantlement of the Medellin cartel and the eventual death of Escobar was not because we cracked the cold one open with them, but rather because we relentlessly pursued them throughout Colombia, and that caused a massive drop in the importation of cocaine in the 90s. That is the comparative that opening opposition defends, where we explain why it's likely the case that this works. Three things in the speech. Firstly, just an explanation on the signaling effect that happens on our side of the house. Secondly, why their policies never work. And finally, getting into the mud on why, like, maybe there's some that works out. First thing I want to talk about is just the signaling effect that exists on side proposition. Because let's be very explicit. The campaigning on past total policies alienates probably the most major supplier of money into Latin America, the United States of America, which has funded the war on drugs, which has funded the vast majority of expeditions that have existed in status quo, also the ability to fund investors on their side of the house. Why is it likely that investors and the United States are significantly deterred? Firstly, note Trump has significantly talked about increasing the war on drugs. If you actively say that you're going to negotiate with these cartels and literally allow them to legalize drugs, we would say you're likely to receive significant sanctions on their side of the house. You're likely to receive significant trade disagreements, and therefore you're unlikely to be able to sell things like drugs within their world. You're unlikely to be able to get that out there. Secondly, we would note you often get embargoes and other forms of sanctions. That is to say that if you literally make Sinaloa cartel a legitimate area, we don't think that the United States is going to be very happy about it, given that the Trump presidency is significantly more right-wing than exists in status quo. Thirdly, the average investor is likely to be quite terrified on their side of the house. And this is really important, panel, because note that when you literally say you're going to legitimize and allow people to sell drugs, when people have massive negative associations with these types of people, just the campaigning often means that the average person within Mexico, that the average investor feels significantly more terrified. They know that the gang now has significantly more power, and they also do not have any way to be protected against this. That means that the amount of foreign direct investment, the amount of money you want to have to rebuild or engage in the past total policies in the first place, fundamentally decreases. Because note, the vast majority of money for this crime fighting isn't magically being generated within these Latin American countries. It is in the United States of America, and the way that that fundamentally funnels down in the first place. I want to weigh this against opening government's contributions in three ways. Firstly, I don't know how they get the money to enact any of their policies. Given that the US is the primary funder of Latin American war on drugs, we don't think their past total policies work within the first place. Secondly, note that fundamental investment is really important for the economic upliftment that opening government wanted to talk about. That is that when you have more money, that is when you're able to engage in opening government's measures within the first place, which means on a comparative, this money is the prerequisite to the vast majority of opening government that they wanted to talk about. Though, and this is really important, panel. This foreign direct investment is the most certain impact on the round. Maybe past total policies succeed. Maybe they don't. Maybe Mano dura policies succeed. Maybe they don't. But just the signaling effect of having billions of dollars withdrawn from your economy, from investors feeling like you can't engage in this, means that we're significantly ahead of opening government outside of the house. I don't care if like some people on the ground feel slightly worse. I think the investment in the United States matters significantly more. Secondly, why is it the case that past total policies are likely to fail over the long term? Note that opening government's incentives apply if the government was in power for the next 12 years. Here's the issue. The reason past total policies do not work on their side of the house is that you don't have good incentive for the one government that engaged in it, but rather other people and new governments come in all the time. And this is the intuitive reason why peace truce has failed, right? Like there was a truce before you had a new government coming into El Salvador. That is the problem with OG because they don't explain why the long-term incentive exists. Reasons why you actually have very nasty incentives on their side of the house. Firstly, political incentives mean that negotiation processes, which often take years, are very hard to enact. You need to mediate and have all of the government done together. However, the average politician literally cannot do this on their side of the house when you are not going to be in office for more than 4 years. So maybe you want to enact this policy. Maybe it would be a good policy if you could be in office for 10 years, but you literally are not in office for that period of time. So it's difficult to enact this. More importantly, opposition parties and others call you out. They tell you you are literally following the cartel. And this, by the way, while it doesn't work for the cartel-controlled areas, it also exists in lots of other places. Brazil has Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo outside of the favelas. So we would note that in many cases, this is political suicide for those areas. This means that even if they get some buy-in from the cartel-driven areas, tons of Other areas exist which are outside of cartel control, and therefore, on a comparative, we think that most of these places have more money. They obviously have like better infrastructure and other things, which support politics to a larger extent. That means that these opposition parties often gain power, and these are not trusted by gangs. Notice that this already means that an opening government, their policies, while they start getting enacted, are never enacted to the fullest extent, and therefore, on a weighing level, we are ahead of opening government there as well. Closing, go for it.
So if the US will give so much money to these politicians if they're violent towards criminals, why wouldn't they lie in campaigning that they will be peaceful and then accept the money from Trump when they actually need the money? Politicians lie all the time.
Yeah, except you won't get it again. You get it for like a small turn, and then you redo it, and then they opt out again, right? That's like the basic case. Finally, then, why are Mano dura policies successful? And why are paz total policies not? Opening governance mechanism here is, guys, you're going to be really, really rational, and every gang is going to listen to you because they're the most rational entities to exist. I want to intuition from this. Even Russia, a fucking state, is not very rational. Notice the way that gangs operate is not on a rational profit incentive of calculus. In most cases, one, these are quite violent people who've been raised in a culture of violence and therefore care about this. But secondly, they care primarily about money. I posit that in most cases they want that control because this is what helps them feel like they are part of something bigger than themselves, control over the entirety of the area. Their incentive applies to people who are lower down on the gang, not the people who are negotiating. Note, the head honcho of the Sinaloa cartel is never the one engaging in violence, and so he's always protected from it. So his incentive to have a turf war, which is because literally you want the two guys to fight each other so you can get more money. The average person on the ground is the one suffering on their side of the house. The head honcho's incentives change, and that controls the incentive calculus on our side of the house. So violence still exists, especially because you often don't trust the government to enforce these. Mano dura, though, does work in two ways. One, we would say it ups the risk calculus on our side of the house. So, comparatively, what Umesh explains is really, really simple. You get shot in the actual head. It's not going to prison. You die. So you cannot continue that violence. But also, just the idea of police brutality means that many people are convinced to turn to things like informants. This, by the way, is how we found Pablo Escobar in the first place and how we lowered the amount of violence we had long period of time. Notably, this is a much more proximate incentive because when you know you could literally get shot, you care about your parents. You care about the fact that you want to live your life at the very least. On a comparative then, what Mano dura does is one, it immediately relieves the pressure on systems, but secondly, it makes it much easier on our side of the house to get rid of these people and actively disincentivize and cut them out of the system, getting justice and faking it so that we have less violence. Very proud to pause.
We thank the speaker for their speech, and that brings us to the end of the top half of the debate. We would like to invite the member of government speaking about half. Here.
Am I clearly visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Go ahead, some chat, please. I'll seek to take opening. I'll begin my speech. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. We're going to explain that campaigning on total peace wins you bigger, stabler governments and more public buy-in for the war on the refusing gangs that inevitably will occur, as OO claimed. I want to start with some framing. Note, our side of the debate has to defend negotiation and the extension of amnesty and tools for reintegration. We don't have to defend soft on crime policing in instances where organizations refuse this outstretched arm of peace. OG do claim this is also about decriminalizing the drug trade, allowing organizations to keep holding on to small arms and just dearming them from heavy weaponry. But this is this House prefers motion. They don't have mech fiat, and they spend no time explaining why this is a plausible implementation of the words of the motion. Note, total peace is defined as negotiating to achieve their disarmament and reintegration. Allowing them to remain armed and continue doing crime is not disarmament nor reintegration. We don't stand by this, and OG's case doesn't stand under the motion. As OO point out, yeah, you can push this total peace to some degree, but pushing this policy hard won't work. OG missed the burden of why implementation is likely to occur based on these premises, and that is what leads us to our case. Our interpretation of the motion is that we allow people total amnesty if they disarm and if they reintegrate. We don't allow them to do crime, and that is not defined in the motion, and it's not in motion clarifications, and it's not a plausible reading or understanding of this debate. I'm sorry, OG, you fucked up this time. Let's start by explaining why this is I want to start by explaining why we agree with opposition that few criminal organizations, especially the strongest and most ruthless among them, would agree to it. But note first that even if some of them agree, that opens up space for those who disagree to step in. They now have free turf. They have de-armed opponents. They have tons of ex-gang members who are looking for re-employment and would love to join them. They have drug suppliers and drug consumers who are looking for a middleman to do the drug trading. Why do we think they're likely to disagree? OG say there is fracturing, disagree to disarm. OG say there is fracturing due to different views on violence. This fracturing would still occur whenever a leader decides to disarm, which some of his subordinates will see as weakness. As I will point out, there's a glorification of violence, and gangs are built on strength and ruthlessness already. This actively dissuades leaders from risking this and risking that their right-hand man will kill them and replace them. Secondly, OJ say cartels are like a business. OO answer this saying this gives them money. We agree. Turf is the method for doing business. Loss of arms or loss of foot soldiers, that's just the cost of doing business, like it was for the owners of the coal mines or the railroads in the Gilded Age of capitalism. It is very plausible to have people you don't give a shit about die, and if that's what earns you billions of dollars. OO also say that these gangs leaders will fear cooperating with the state, who they don't perceive as a reliable actor. We agree with all of this. So let's move on to my case. Why do we think you're going to win a bigger mandate in the election? As OG assert, and we're going to further analyze, buy-in from the civilian population to these gangs is large. One, people are helped by the gangs as their local charities, their local courts, as employers of last resort for a rainy day. Two, people's siblings or cousins or fathers or neighbors or best friends from school belong to these gangs. They don't see them as fundamentally evil. Three, the war on crime itself has a lot of casualties. The police are corrupt and have killed people, so is the military. The USA has killed people in their interventions. They are seen as a form of novel colonialism. What is the solution to this? We say, one, we have goodwill. We give people a chance to leave it. This shows a moral high ground that we have. Two, we're showing a willingness to compromise and forgive crime. It shows that we are forward-thinking instead of being stuck in the past. These two reasons mean that civilian populations are more likely to buy into the fight that we are suggesting than anyone else is suggesting and are more likely to vote for us. On the comparative note, we actively lose or barely win elections on offside. The increased military and police presence hasn't worked before, other than in El Salvador, which is an outlier. It failed in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Mexico, in Ecuador, in Costa Rica, everywhere but El Salvador. Panel, if you have the spec to know that it worked in El Salvador, you also know that the American security establishment, the DEA and CIA themselves, have been unable to halt the supply of drugs and the strength of these gangs in all these other countries. But secondly, you get far more stories of individual victims of the war on drugs, which creates empathy and backlash. When you hear that mere mules or bystanders get gunned down by the military in city streets, when you hear people get falsely identified as criminals and killed with no knock warrants, when you hear that people are imprisoned harshly for decades just for selling drugs, you oppose all of this policy. The bottom line here means if we get a larger government with more MPs and far more of a perception of popular mandate for the elected politicians. Let's talk then about how we fight them better once they disagree, as I analyzed in my first burden that they would. We get more public buy-in for the war on crime generally. What is the solution here? Beyond the goodwill I said before, the reason why you now think that these people deserve to be fought is you believe they have continued guilt and inherent evilness. The fact that they chose to stay in the organization, criminal org gangs, means that they didn't just get stuck in a state of violence at age 16 and now don't have any out because the state would imprison them. They actively choose to stay despite being offered amnesty. And it also shows that there's no alternative. We offered them an out and they refused it. We offered them reintegration, but they insist on fighting to the death, ours or theirs. As an outcome, you're far more likely to have win a re-election, which is crucial for continuity, which I'll explain later. And two, you get more active public support for localized crime-fighting efforts, i.e. informing to the police. Let's explain that my next burden, why you're less likely to be outvoted for controversial anti-crime policy or be less susceptible to blackmail or corruption of MPs. Why are you going to be less likely to be outvoted for controversial anti-crime policy? One, because many people have strong views on this, which means, including for support of gangs in opposition to war, which means that now you have far more politicians on your side, so you need far more members of parliament to betray you in order to drop your government. Before I continue, let's take a PR from opening.
Maybe you get more popularity in the cartel-driven borders of Brazil. The elites and oligarchs live in like Rio de Janeiro, they feel their life, their bottom line, their business is going bad due to this policy, they'll vote you out because
I don't think this is true. You didn't notice my analysis. I am not my opening. You're also more likely to survive other votes of no confidence on things like economic issues or random scandals. This is crucial because continuity of policy is crucial for efficacy of long-term policy. You have to have long-term planning in order to solve deeply ingrained problems. You have to appoint officials to relevant roles and give them time to gain experience. About turns and a new government, a new policy means you lose all the progress you already made. So this re-election and public mandate is crucial. Why are you less susceptible to blackmailed or corrupted MPs? First, you just have to corrupt or blackmail far more MPs in order to block policy or collapse the government when it starts succeeding versus the gangs. Secondly, there's far greater public backlash against these MPs for sitting pro-crime. They no longer have the excuse that they're simply forgiving and have goodwill and are forward thinking because that is the government policy they're opposing. And finally, these politicians have more of a sense of public and moral obligation if the whole country supports this fight back. So both their personal incentive to win re-election and their salary and security detail and their morals tell them that they should no longer give in to corruption or blackmail. All of this means we are far more able to impact and influence anti-gang policy, including tough on crime policy on our side. And for all of those reasons, go with closing government.
We thank the speaker for their speech. We would like to invite the member of OP here.
Hello, can everyone hear and see me?
Yes, please.
Thank you. This debate has spent too much time talking about narcotics, but not enough time about the drug that makes the world run: money. Because the most vulnerable individuals aren't cartel members, they're the ones who rely on remittances from a now angry US, the ones who rely on the slightest drop of an economy and the drop of a bullet. We're very proud to stand on closing opposition. Two broad extensions here. First, I'm going to win or mitigate the opening government clash and government clash to explain why their policy, no matter how much money you take, requires a very high burden to be effective. Second, I'm going to fill in the gaps of the DLO's argument on the US, explain why it's a plausible outcome, and give active harms even if you don't buy the clash on narcotics. First, let's talk about what they need in order to prove it. And here, I want to note something, right? In order for them to be able to win, they, as CG correctly identifies, need sustainable, long-term pumping of money into this program in order for people to believe in it. And the reason for this is because Latin America, in many cases, runs on very thin coalitions because of the result of proportional representation systems that they often inherit from their colonial predecessors. So any shift in policy often requires a large amount of buy-in from people. Here's the problem. In order for them to give viable alternative work to these people, their policy requires a lot more factors to succeed than they think. One, they need an actually effective and running Mexican Latin American economy that former cartel members can actually shift to. And the problem then is they need these, clearly the economy in these countries is not good enough. It takes quite a while to build an economy, and they don't have that on their side of the house. But second, and I really want to point out here, right, the likely reaction from the US from this policy is likely to tighten control along the border for drugs, as well as expelling drug members from the US into Latin America. And what that means is that the demand for these drugs is likely to tighten significantly. This puts significant pressure on gangs to fight for what minimal territory is left in order for these routes to make any form of profit. Given that the government is likely to spend a lot of time disarming many of these military from Mexico or Latin America, when these gangs start fighting each other, the government is unlikely to be able to be an effective broker because they themselves don't have the power required to enforce the agreements that these narcotics agents, these gangs actually sign in the first place. But also, I want to point out here, right? They say gangs are rational. This is like just an assertion, right? So I'm going to give a reason why gangs are not rational, and so like this washes, right? Because many of these gang leaders have been gang leaders for an extremely long period of time, constantly surrounded by sycophants who say yes to every little thing that they say and do. They are extremely sensitive to slights on their like power. What this means is that they are very likely to make radical plays with the men under their control because they don't have to face the direct and immediate consequences of it. So it's also quite likely that they could be crazy. But also, and I think this is important here, right? Given that government lacks the enforcement mechanism, they are unlikely to be seen as a serious and honest mediator between these cartels. When these cartels fight, violence still happens. Last observation I want to make before I move on to the real hard-hitting stuff about the government bench case, right? In order for a lot of their policies to work, they don't just need about 50% of the Mexican or Latin American population to be okay with cartels. They need an overwhelming amount of them to be okay with cartels because insofar as many of these cartel members experience any form of backlash from the civilian population, any form of being turned down from a job because of poor economic prospects, they're likely to turn back to these gangs and be increasingly resentful of these policies in the first place. As a result, then, in many cases, their policy doesn't meet the tipping point in order for it to succeed in the first place. Second thing I want to talk about then, let's talk about the US. Here, all talks about the signaling effect that this has to like other like companies or countries around the world. Like, this is fine. But what they don't explain to you is why uniquely Latin America is vulnerable to this particular signaling effect. The reason why they are so incredibly vulnerable to this signaling effect is many of these Latin American economies are A, incredibly reliant on remittances from the US in the first place. What's the outcome here? This means that in many cases, Trump is likely to do things like expel a lot more undocumented immigrants than he otherwise would have on their side of the house. That doesn't mean expelling undocumented immigrants. He might do that anyway. But it also means, by the way, harsher policies on citizens of these Latin American countries that end up in these places. This might, for example, look like banks, for example, or like large investors pulling out of these banks. And we all know the problem here, right? Which is that Latin America has a massive debt crisis that often means that these bad policies trickle down to the weakest person. How does this link back to the motion, just in case you don't believe me, right? This also means, by the way, that these gangs get more people joining the cartel, but less alternative economic outcomes for them. So this further harms the government effectiveness of the government bench policy. I'll take a POI from OG right now.
So if closing government is not standing for policies that would allow cartels to continue business operations unarmed and legally, then the population would oppose their amnesty because they would still remove their cartel jobs and cartel provide services, so they wouldn't get the violence. That case is nonsense.
If you say so. Anyway, I'm moving on here, right? Like, the key point, therefore, is that in many cases, these people are especially vulnerable to these specific shifts, and that often means that the worst off are the ones that are harmed. This closes the gap that we get in the opening opposition case about the US merely doing something. But the second thing I want to point out here, right? There are other harms that the US is able and likely to pull out. Because this argument from opening opposition is vulnerable to the claim that says that, oh, actually, in many cases, the US will always try to like fund and help these Latin American countries because their populations deserve it. But the problem right now is that the US population in the status quo is particularly bloodthirsty. And the reason for this is because they spent a very long time having very extremely high prices that their politicians have blamed upon immigrants in the status quo. As a result, then, any like form when you see on Fox News or any other thing is likely to lead to a very large amount of pullout on the part of these governments from these places in the first place. And that worsens many of the economic costs that they have. But even if you don't buy the economic costs, that also means like just more kids in cages. That means more immigrants dying as they cross the Rio Grande in many cases. These are active harms that we need to discuss in this debate. The government in this debate cannot countenance by simply being glib about some strange argument of an amnesty agreement on their side of the debate. So what have I done in this speech? I've done two things. First, I've either flipped or mitigated, depends on how much you believe, the harms the government have talked about in terms of the effectiveness of the amnesty, but with new and better reasons that actually explain why they need a very high tipping point to succeed. Second, I've placed pressure on this tipping point by explaining to you why the US is crucial to it, but also given you harms outside the narcotics trade and given you a new actor that is way more likely and more directly to be harmed. As a result, therefore, even if you don't buy this entire debate about narcotics, you do buy that the Latin American economy gets much worse because other countries are likely to do things like blockade its ports, for example, to do greater, and that harms its companies as well. For all of these reasons, CO.
I think the speaker for their speech would like to invite the Gov Whip here.
Only POIs in chat, please. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to start by washing out a lot of this debate. The key piece of framing that top half misses is that politicians lie, and especially notoriously, politicians in Latin America have been known to lie. Why is this important? Because top half largely discusses whether these policies are ineffective or effective, but they spend very little time talking about the likelihood of campaigning for these policies, leading to these policies actually being done effectively. Note that both top half teams have the definitional fiat to tell me what this campaigning is going to look like. There needs to be an additional step of analysis to tell me why this campaigning will translate into effective policies. So while OG might have a good solvency in terms of why these policies could work, they don't actually explain why these policies will be implemented. Opening opposition has a lot of pieces of washing out that allegedly harm the OG case, but actually harm top half as a whole. So let me elaborate on what OO said and explain why it doesn't just hurt OG, but it hurts the entire top half clash. Firstly, note that while politicians might have the incentive to defeat the gangs to get re-elected, note that they have competing incentives as well. In a lot of these countries, politicians are aware that they're probably not going to beat the gangs on either side of the house because, as top half concedes, these gangs are deeply entrenched. So their primary electoral incentive isn't to implement the best policies possible because probably the chance of failure is high either way. Therefore, you're probably thinking about different competing incentives. For example, how many bribes can you take from the gangs and whether it's strategic to take a bribe from gang A or from gang B so that you can have a viable campaign later on. Or, as DLO points out, funding from other countries, such as Donald Trump telling you that if you suddenly pivot to being harsh in terms of the war on drugs, Donald Trump is going to give you a shit ton of money, and you can use this money for future campaigning when inevitably probably you fail against the war on drugs. The response we get from opening opposition to this is, but you can only do this once because if you lie once, then you won't get elected again. What a meme. Politicians have lied again and again in Latin America, and still they got re-elected, which means that this is probably a stronger incentive for them insofar as your party can stay afloat and pay for its legal fees and for future campaigning and stuff like that. Thirdly, I actually think I mentioned all of this, which means that the entire top half clash is very dubious because, as CEO member points out, you need to have continual funding of these policies to work. CEO says that you need to have continual funding of negotiations for them to work, but this also applies for the opposition case. For you to effectively dismantle these gangs, you need to continually supply your police force with weapons to crack them down. You need to have highly organized operations that something takes months at a time. And insofar as politicians are corrupt, insofar as you don't have a strong enough mandate, you can't execute any of this. So as MO points out, this entire debate is about whether you have a strong enough mandate to be able to resist competing incentives such as bribes from gangs or such as the coalition disintegrating because someone wants to exit the coalition. We also accept the framing that the majority of governments in Latin America are formed by coalitions. Now, to be fair to opening government, in DPM, they do say in response to OO that gangs give a lot of employment to people, so that's why people are going to vote for us because you're going to be merciful on the gangs. However, Ayal is a lot more structural as to why we're going to have functional large coalitions. The first reason is that it is a lot easier to enter the coalition when you know you're not going to be proximately blamed for a violent conflict. When violence breaks out because you had a police operation and there is collateral damage, you can be directly blamed for this. When, however, peace negotiations fail, sure, you're still going to have some accountability because you were supposed to bring this peace, but it is the gangs themselves who broke your trust. It is the gang themselves who were violent. So you're less likely to tank in the polls as compared to you being violent, which is something that is directly something that has caused the loss of lives. It's a lot easier for journalists to sensationalize this. Secondly, and this is also an important piece of analysis that IL gives, you're going to gain trust from the people because you're going to tell them that you you will give them grace if they are acting in good faith. Not only does this reach the benefit of you having more criminals and their family members willingly voting for you, but later on, if the criminals themselves or if the criminal organizations don't negotiate with you or they renege, then they're going to be seen as less accountable in the eyes of the people. They're not going to be seen as actors who are actually virtuous and helping their community because they could have had peace, but they chose not to, which means that in comparison, they're going to be seen as less valuable political agents. And probably they need to make these commitments at the point of campaigning because they also have internal communication with their constituents insofar as they talk to them and provide services and stuff like that. I said no visual POIs. I'll take you a bit later. Thirdly, a large number of swing voters in particular, have people who are in crime gangs. So this debate agrees that a lot of people know someone who is in a gang, but in particular, poor people who don't have a political ideology know people. Because people who are of a middle class probably tend to vote right wing or left wing because they have time to read. But people who are undecided tend to be people who are really, really poor and were forced into crime. So if you want to target these swing voters, you want to be kind to criminals and give them amnesty, because if you do, then you know they might know someone and don't want them to go to prison. I'll take OO.
You attract several poor people who want these peace policies. We attract several people, victims who want tough policy. The deadlock breaker are the elites, the investors, countries like US, which change and tip the election.
Here's why this isn't true. It is because we uniquely target the criminals, and in terms of the people who were affected by crime, all they want is for the crime to end. So they are still swing voters on our side. So why will criminals believe in us? And this answers CO. Well, it is because we give them amnesty. Lucy has this clarifying way in POI is that, but according to our model, or rather, if you don't legalize all crime, then they're not going to have this incentive. Well, if we give those who surrender amnesty, then they do have the incentive. But honestly, this definitional challenge is unimportant. Even if we are completely bound to the OG model, all of our additional reasons still stand. This is totally irrelevant. Why do we then beat OG with this mandate? We beat them because we activate their corruption case. For you to effectively execute any single policy, such as, for example, on OO having a violent crackdown, or on government having a process of negotiation, what you need to do is to have enough people in parliament, such as that if some people are being blackmailed, if some people turn against you, you can execute it in the long run. So on CO's metric of long-term execution of any policy you choose, we uniquely get this stability, and that's why CG wins this debate.
We thank that speaker for their speech. We would like to invite the upward to end the debate here.
Can I confirm that I'm audible? Yeah. Okay. If there are any POIs, please put them in the chat. I'm going to start with our extensions and then go through closing government and then opening government. Starting with the extension, our main extension is to explain that there are much greater harms of this policy than just the US pulling out of this specific policy. It is increased discrimination towards people from Latin America. It is harsher policies against Latin American countries in a way that literally starves them of their economic benefits, and in a way that means people are more likely to enter gangs and cartels under their side of the house. So it's clear that under opening government and closing government, they don't actually solve the root causes, which is the economic deprivation that these countries face that forces them towards entering cartels and gangs in the first place. The first thing I want to point out is how this deals with opening opposition. So I want to note that obviously DLO says some things about the USA. They say investors and the US and Trump in particular will pull out. I want to be very clear about how we add to this. The first thing we add to this is we explain why the attitudes of the people in the USA are likely to be one that is bloodthirsty. That insofar as now you are afraid of drugs entering your border because there is no tough on crime policy, insofar as that there's a huge possible risk, and you can't justify that. Like you can sort of speculate that maybe in 10, 20 years, the Latin American economy will sort of improve improved enough to solve the drug problem, but you can't justify it now to US voters. What they're likely to do is to take far harsher stance against Latin American countries, and in particular also immigrants coming to the US. So Gareth tells you about how, for example, you are more likely to expel US immigrants. Obviously, this exists under Trump, but it's also state-level governments doing these things, specifically state-level governments that are near the border, for example, with the USA. They are more likely to do things like kick out these individuals or putting them into jail, the millions of undocumented immigrants. And that means that Americans just start oppressing far more Latin American people within their border. They expel them because they see them as possibly linked towards the gang trade and towards cartels. They destroy remittances, which is a clear and immediate direct economic harm towards Latin American economies, as opposed to the vague notion of the US pulling out. But the second thing to point out is that we also explain quite clearly why you're more likely to pull out and not support these policies under under their side of the house. That is because the benefit of this specific peace policy is internalized primarily to Latin American countries and not the US. That is to say, you being able to like create daycares for like the children of like gang leaders or whatever, and like improving their economy, it's hard to justify to the average US voter. That is to say, because Gareth explains why the US is already in a state of wanting to focus domestically, of having to face high rising prices, for example, that harms them economically and therefore harms the average American. And so they feel directly the effects of that. It is hard to justify spending more and more money towards improving the Latin American economies if you don't prove towards US voters that this has a direct benefit to you, but via like, giving success stories of when you're able to crack down on these gangs, or saying that you will take a tough on crime policy as a result. So what happens under their side of the house is clearly the policies do not get implemented towards their fullest capacity, but we also have a direct harm, which is that you also just economically deprive Latin American countries. That is a bigger harm than what opening opposition tells you in this debate. The second thing I want to do in explaining why this takes over opening opposition is because, like, obviously they have some other stuff about the principle and like the specific solvency of violence, which I'll sort of get into when I talk about violence, but specifically on the principle, I just think they kind of drop it, right? Like the metric ends up being that like if you starve more people under their side of the house and you hurt more people, I think that is principally unjust at the end of the day. I think the thing is, opening opposition doesn't explain how you're able to necessarily overpower these gangs, right? So they can say like the government contention is that you will draw out violence. That is based on the characterization that you have equal power with these gangs and you sort of draw out that violence. Our analysis on the US explains why being bankrolled by the US gives you immense proportionate amounts of power, which means that maybe violence ramps up in like a few months, but it means that you're able to overpower these gangs. You're able to do this strategically. You're able to effectively take out the gang leaders, which, sort of messes the gang apart because they don't have sort of that coordination as well, which means that it becomes far easier to deal with like the lower levels of that gang. So all of that means like that asymmetric analysis exists under our side of the house, and that's why we actually unlock the benefits that we hear from opening opposition. Moving on to closing government. Closing government's big extension is on the idea of more public buy and support. I guess they sort of do this roundabout thing where like, some gangs might agree, some gangs might not agree. I'll deal with that later. But the first thing to point out is that our narrative is also sympathetic as well, to the point where I don't think this ends up being significant, right? Like people maybe care about the gang members to some extent, but I think if anything, people care about the victims as well. Is the fact that like obviously different people are affected by gangs differently, and I think the fact that there are different areas of that country, not everyone is going to be like in an area that is like tightly linked towards gang violence or tightly linked towards cartel violence, means that there's just likely to be very varying support towards this policy. And as we've pointed out, the bar that closing government needs to fill in this debate is more than 50%, or like a significant number of support in order to have a change in this debate, or else like obviously either policy will have some level of backlash. I don't think they prove it is more likely than not that most people will support it and that this will be overwhelming support. But the second thing to point out is that public buy-in is just not required at all in this debate. That is firstly, as they say, politicians are able to lie. Politicians are able to craft the narrative, to selectively highlight and use the media to highlight the evils of these drug cartels, to spin the narratives in order to influence their voters. And so if they say people will empathize with the gang members, I think it is far easier to spin the narrative in a way that people will sympathize more with the victims, to the innocents that had no choice to be like, who had to face human trafficking or drug trafficking and all of these things. But secondly, Latin America is like, obviously these governments are not like super perfect democracies. There's some leeway to be more authoritarian, to implement these policies harshly. And even though there might be some protests, I think these are likely to be very short term. So clearly, thirdly, our extension is also just far more influential because the capacity of being able to do this policy from the US is a far greater determining factor. Like, I guess the worst harm of public buy-in is that some people protest, but like, if the comparative is that you just get no implementation of policy, I think that is far worse anyway. Before I move on, OG.
So leaving aside you describing existing US policy proposals, private investors primarily care about stability, and we've proven your policies increase instability and signal instability. Illegal immigrants get detained on both sides. You're just creating more of them by increasing violence and instability in the region.
No. So I think first of all, I'll deal with instability as well. But secondly, even just like announcing this policy, right? Like it's very like you can't definitively prove that one thing is going to be create more instability or another. Like that remains for the policy itself to be implemented. This argument is obviously pre any policy being implemented. So the harms still apply. Like it's not like you implement the policy and like roll it back later on, right? So finally to opening government. So opening government has a case specifically on like the violence against politicians, but also general violence. Here's the problem with their argument on violence. The first thing to point out is that violence is almost always an innate characteristic of cartels and gangs. That is because violence is innate to securing your profits per RPOI. That is because warring against other gangs, for example, is like killing your business competitors, which is good for business. So if opening government's analysis that these gangs are profit motivated, clearly that also happens under their side of the house. And this is a risk you're willing to take because the outflow of that is like you lose a few soldiers, but you gain much more money from being able to gain territory to sell your drugs, etc. But secondly, in the best case scenario where you do disarm and there's no violence, I don't think the violence from a gun and a violence from being kidnapped and trafficked and allowing these gangs to run rampant is any different. Lives are still ruined under their side of the house, and we have some level of deterrence. For those reasons, very proud to stand on closing up.